So you see folks on? Okay, good. Well, welcome everybody and good evening. I appreciate all of you for joining us for this town hall tonight to learn more about air quality and the urgently low water levels of the Great Salt Lake. I am Senator Derek Kitchen, and I represent Utah's capital city here in the Utah legislature. The dual problems of bad air quality and our statewide drought continue to weigh heavily on our community. Due to the drought conditions throughout our state, Governor Cox recently declared a state of emergency. In fact, over 90% of the state of Utah is currently experiencing extreme drought. This is part of the reason why the Great Salt Lake is in such rough shape these days. Today, the water level at the Great Salt Lake is at the lowest in recorded history. This leads to a loss of habitat, a decrease in water flows, and it ultimately has a negative impact on our already poor air quality along the Wasatch Front here in Utah. I appreciate all of the constituent engagement on this matter. And certainly I've been receiving all kinds of emails and correspondence and a lot of really concerned phone calls and just general engagement with the public. So I appreciate all of your focus on these critical issues. Air quality and the Great Salt Lake are policy priorities for me because they're so personal. They're so personal, they're visible, and it ultimately impacts the general health of all of us. It impacts the natural environment, our local economy, and frankly, our quality of life. We know that climate change is an indisputable fact, and that climate change is compounding the already existing environmental challenges that we face here in the high desert of Utah. It's important that my colleagues in the Utah legislature join me in taking immediate action to bring additional water into the lake, as well as craft regulation that allows us to not only conserve water, but that we save the Great Salt Lake before it's too late. These policies must be driven by data and science, and it's important that we listen to subject matter experts. And that's what brings us here today. So tonight I have invited 3 experts to provide some general background, some updates on the lake and our air quality, especially given the fact that the shrinking lake will intensify the pollution and again, compound the already negative issues relating to our air quality here in Utah. First up tonight, we're going to hear from Dr. Carrie Kelly. She's an associate professor of chemical engineering at the University of Utah. Dr. Kelly serves on the Air Quality Policy Board, and she co-founded the University of Utah's program for air quality, health, and society. Her research focuses on the links between energy, air quality, and human health. Then we'll receive some updates from Bryce. He's the director of the Utah Division of Air Quality, a really important role these days. Bryce has led the Division of Air Quality since 2011, and he began his career with the DEQ in 1991, 20 years beforehand. The Division of Air Quality is charged with safeguarding and improving Utah's air, land, and water through balanced regulation. And finally, this evening, we will be hearing from Candace Hasenyager. She's the director of the Utah Division of Water Resources, also a very important role these days. She'll speak to the Great Salt Lake and its current levels. Throughout Candace's career, she has worked on various projects to support the division's mission to plan, conserve, and develop and protect Utah's water resources. At the end of the town hall tonight, we'll save a little bit of time so that we can have questions and answers and get any additional information out there. For those of you tuning in online, you have the option to raise your hand. I believe that button is toward the bottom of your screen. And then we can call on you when it comes time for the Q&A session. You will be unmuted to ask any question that you may have. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible given the time constraints. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining once again, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kelly. Please take it away.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. And before I start, I wanted to say that we do face a lot of challenges. We have made quite a bit of progress, and I think Bryce will probably talk about that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that it is not all gloom and doom. I think we can definitely make some changes. Okay, so along the Wasatch Front here, we suffer from three key challenges. One is wintertime fine particulate matter, which I think is a bit of a success story here. Summertime ozone and wildfire and dust events. And the dust events are aggravated by the shrinking level of the Great Salt Lake. And as Senator Kitchen mentioned, it is one of our biggest detractors to quality of life, and it has significant health impacts. So one of the challenges that we are facing with the decreasing levels of the Great Salt Lake is that air quality and the Great Salt Lake levels are very tightly coupled. And there are metals in some areas of the Great Salt Lake that are of concern. Arsenic is one of them. So keeping that protective crust and keeping the lake level stable is very important to our air quality and our health. And the potential to emit dust along the Great Salt Lake is really variable. So it is kind of a big challenge for us. I wanted to mention just a couple other things. So we live in this constrained airshed. So when we're adding more emissions and we're adding more population, we have to figure out a way to cut emissions so that we can maintain our quality of life. And that is a challenge in the context of a changing climate. I also wanted to mention that the west side of Salt Lake does tend to have poorer air quality than the east side. And we're looking at putting more development out there. So that's something we definitely want to keep an eye on. And then I wanted to make one final comment with respect to the inland port and increased development out there, is that there are other ports around the nation, and a lot of them have clean air action plans. And I think it's something we should definitely think about, because if we are not leading in terms of the port and clean air, we will be following. And we've seen this in other industries like oil and gas, where if you do not have good standards and regulations, you will end up with all of the equipment that no one else is going to allow in their airshed. So with that, I will turn it over to Bryce. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Just a couple quick points as we get started. So at the Division of Air Quality, we are responsible for implementing the Federal Clean Air Act within the state of Utah and the clean air programs. That Clean Air Act has been designed by Congress and crafted by further regulation by the Environmental Protection Agency to establish health standards for air pollution across the country. And as part of that, the congressional charge to EPA was that they review those standards every 5 years to ensure that they are still protective of public health with an adequate margin of safety. And so over the years, we've seen both increasing protection of those standards as we learn more about the impacts of air pollution. And then, of course, we've been developing plans and strategies to address the air pollution that we experience here along the Wasatch Front and in other parts of the state. So as Dr. Kelly mentioned, we've actually monitored in the Salt Lake Valley since the late 1950s. And of course, for those that were around at that time or a little bit later as we move through the history, of course, my home in Sugar House was heated by a coal burning stove even when we moved in there. And as you can understand, with those types of air pollution, very uncontrolled, very inefficient combustion, the levels of air pollution in the 50s were much higher than they are today. And it's something that I mentioned to highlight both that kind of some encouragement that we've been able to accommodate growth, both in industry, in commercial activity, and of course in population. But in doing it by adopting technologies that allow us to do the work we do on a daily basis, but do it with fewer air pollutant emissions. In particular, as we look at the sources of air pollution now that impact both our winter air pollution along the Wasatch Front and our summer ozone levels along the Wasatch Front, a lot of the same types of activities are responsible or contribute to that air pollution. As we look back in history, of course, a lot of the easy regulation has already been done. It is very efficient to go to a large coal burning utility, a power plant, for instance, and add controls to that in order to reduce pollution by large amounts. And so those were the easy targets back in the 1970s and 1980s to address our air pollution. Now what we're looking at is, since those have already been controlled to a certain level, that the majority of the pollution comes from our daily activities as individuals. So the vehicles that we drive, of course, that's a fuel combustion source. It has emissions associated with that. And then all of our daily activities from foods, restaurants, dry cleaning, even paints and solvents that we use on a daily basis are all very small as individuals, but they add up to the largest portion of the inventory or the air pollutants that are responsible for our high air pollution concentrations. So we have kind of two particular challenges. In the wintertime, we have the temperature inversions. Typically that happens when there's snow on the ground and a high pressure system moves in, it traps the air at the valley floor, and all the emissions that we generate as a society build up under that inversion layer until the next storm comes and clears it out. Over the past several years, that has been a focus of our planning efforts, looking at controls on wood stoves, the industrial controls I already mentioned, and improvements in vehicles that started with the emissions testing program that we are familiar with, as well as the benefit of federal fleet and fuel standards that has improved the efficiency of our vehicles with respect to air pollution. The second and kind of more recent and at the top of our mind are two issues in the summertime. That is our summertime ozone, and that is typically in our urban areas. We see ozone values peak in the afternoons at levels that are above the current air quality health standard. And that is usually that happens on days that are above 95 degrees. Again, a high pressure system with no clouds. And so if we have a very stagnant summer afternoon with a clear sunny sky, that is when we typically see the ozone values that are higher. And then of course, I don't need to tell this to anyone, particular challenges this year with smoke from transported from wildfires in the west. It's kind of interesting to note as we looked at the air monitoring data this summer, we saw the smoke, we smelled the smoke, had those impacts, but for about 16 days this summer, we exceeded the health standard PM 2.5, or that fine particulate that's associated with the smoke. But on 39 days here in Salt Lake County, we exceeded the federal ozone standard that is both enhanced by the smoke and as well as those other activities and sources of air pollution that I mentioned earlier. So even as bad as this summer was for smoke pollution, it's still that summertime ozone that is our biggest current challenge. And I think the theme of this meeting, and we'll talk about more, of course, is right now we have a large source of potential dust that's located to the north and the west of the Salt Lake area, and that is the Great Salt Lake. With the drying of Farmington Bay, that has exposed beach areas that are now subject to wind erosion. And we've seen examples in other lakes in the world and within our own state. Some dry lake beds in the West Desert have been responsible for dust impacting the Salt Lake Valley from wind events in the springtime for many, many years. Of course, those lakes or those dry lake beds are very distant. And as we look to the future, a big concern is having a large exposed lake bed, of course, much closer to the Salt Lake Valley, and of course, having the impacts directly to individuals that live in the valley. So a number of air quality challenges. Again, the news isn't all bad. We are making progress with the majority of those and have plans in place that see progress in the future. But as we grow, it's something that we need to not rest on the success that we've had so far. Clearly, as we've done our projections and modeling, that as we see more growth in the valleys, and especially as we tend to grow outside of the city center, we see vehicle miles traveled increasing at about twice the rate of population. And so if we don't find new technologies and adopt new practices, kind of the controls that are already in place will be overwhelmed by growth within about the next 12 to 15 years. And so again, we're not done yet, but we are encouraged that we can find technologies that can improve air quality while having a robust and growing society and economy here along the Wasatch Front.
Thank you, Director Bird. Before we move on to the Division of Water Quality, I want to stay on air for just a minute and perhaps ask a couple of questions that might allow the general public and anybody tuning in today to better understand how we are paying attention to the issue of air quality here in the region. So can you just at a high level explain to us how we measure clean air versus dirty air, and what are some of the tools that we use in your division to do this?
Okay, and I'll let Dr. Kelly also talk about some fascinating new developments as well on the consumer side for knowing what our air pollution is. So we have an air monitoring network that is part of the federal air quality program. It is based on populated areas. So you look for the areas of highest exposure and the largest population that will be exposed. And then we develop monitoring plans that provide representative monitoring that covers that population area. The monitors are placed at the areas that, so we look at emissions inventories, which means how much everything emits or pollutes. Then we put those into computer models that predict where the highest area of expected air pollution concentration is. And then we put monitors there. They are very intensive with respect to quality assurance and helping them to run efficiently. And so there are very few of them. So we have 21 monitors that cover the entire state. And again, focused on the population centers within the state. And that is what we compare to the regulatory standards. And that is the data that's available on our website or through the airnow.gov EPA site as well. So we operate all the monitoring that happens on the regulatory side within the state of Utah that is compared to the federal air quality standards. But there's great developments at our universities looking at other options as well.
So that's a good segue for you, Dr. Kelly. Can you answer that question, but also maybe address the difference between PM 2.5 and PM 10 and any other sort of variations in the air quality issues that we face?
Oh, sure thing. Okay, so first I'll talk about the sort of new developments and technology. So sensors have been getting cheaper and cheaper, and Bryce's team does a great job with these really expensive regulatory monitors. But because sensors have been getting cheaper, people have been buying their own sensors and then putting them out. And it turns out that there's some challenges with that. On the other hand, when you get lots and lots of these sensors out, and we've been doing work, as have others, who have figured out clever ways to integrate all this information to help us see things that we can't see from just the Division of Air Quality Network. For example, there are many places in the state that don't have the population or the emission sources to have any monitors at all. And when they're affected by things like wildfire smoke, they really have very little idea of what their air quality is like. So the types of sensors that we are looking at for particulate matter and ozone and other species can really help us understand some of this distribution of pollution. And then the other question was, what was the difference between PM 2.5 and PM 10? And it's all about the size. So PM 2.5 is about 100th, or maybe a 10th the size of human hair, so much smaller than a human hair. And it can penetrate very deeply into your lungs, where it can actually pass into the bloodstream. So, so that's a very important indicator of health effects of air pollution. In fact, PM 2.5 is probably the one driver of adverse health effects for people. PM 10 is a little bit bigger, but you can still breathe it in. And PM 10 is often what you'll see from like dust from the Great Salt Lake. That tends to fall into the PM 10 category. And things from like vehicle emissions tend to fall into the PM 2.5 category.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly and Director Bird. I'm going to shift gears just briefly so that we can hear a little bit of an update from the Division of Water Quality. So as mentioned in the introduction, we have Candace Hossenager, and if I messed up your name, please correct me. But if you wouldn't mind doing a brief introduction of yourself and the role you play within the state, and then if you wouldn't mind jumping in and taking the floor to discuss issues relating to water that you're paying close attention to these days.
Great, thank you, Senator Kitchen. My name is Candace Hossenager. I'm the director at the Division of Water Resources, and I'm actually very new to this role. I became the director on September 6th, I think. So it's been fun. It's been a wild ride. So our mission here at Water Resources is to plan, conserve, develop, and protect Utah's water resources. We have about a staff of 45 people who are dedicated and work passionately to fulfill that mission. And as you can imagine, this year it's been challenging. 2021 will go down as one for the books, right? We've had, what have we had this year? A worldwide pandemic, wild weather events also hit hard, including record high temperatures, flooding, and drought, as Utah experienced some of the worst water supply conditions on record. In July, 99.94% of the state was in extreme and exceptional drought, which are the two worst drought categories by the Drought Monitor, which comes out every Thursday. At the same time, the Great Salt Lake and Lake Powell both dropped below their previous record lows. And then we had a wild swing in our weather from hot and dry, which we experienced in the spring and early summer, to intense rainfall and flooding in late July and August. The rain helped improve our soil moisture, reduced some of the wildfire risks that we had been fearing, and reduced the demand as people shut off their sprinklers. However, as this group probably knows, our rain does not fill reservoirs. That is, we are based on a snow-driven hydrology where we rely on our snowpack. About 95% of our water supply comes from our snow and the runoff that comes from it in the springtime. So the rains, while they helped in a lot of different ways, they did little to refill our depleted reservoirs. It will take an above average snowpack to refill our reservoirs and continued conservation to stretch our water supply. And we did have impressive response, and I've heard feedback from a variety of people that said, in my neighborhood we saw yellow lawns all over, and then other people's was like, I was just at the governor's Western Governors Association meeting that they had in Salt Lake, and there was one lady who's like, mine was the only yellow lawn in our block. So I recognize this is not widespread for everywhere, but there were a lot of yellow lawns and a lot of response. For example, Salt Lake City Public Utilities, they reduced their water use this year compared to the previous 3 years by about 27% or 20%, which was almost 1 billion gallons of water. So impressive reductions compared to the previous years. So this year, I'll be really frank, we've been really focused on drought and drought response, and really trying to get people to reduce their water use. The governor came out with 4 kind of measures to fast track water use, which includes integrating land use and water planning, metering secondary connections, that's untreated water that's used in some areas of the state, that's used on lawns and gardens. It's not everywhere, but if you have it, it is usually what they say. And also agricultural optimization. And we've also put in a building block request for the governor's 4th one, to have a statewide kind of turf buyback program, to be able to offer rebates and incentives to convert landscape to water wise. So conservation has been a big focus, now, and it will be into the future.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can we talk a little bit about the Great Salt Lake? This is an area of focus for a lot of us in the community. We're really concerned about the Great Salt Lake and the impacts that we're seeing due to historic drought, but also clearly the impacts due to a shifting climate and all of the variables that we simply can't control as humans or policymakers. So, I think that the namesake for our capital city, Salt Lake City, right? This is something that we all hold very close to us. So if you could speak to the historic drop in water levels, and we've already heard from Dr. Kelly and others that there are, metal contaminants perhaps at the lake bed. Would you mind speaking to, the situation that the Great Salt Lake currently, finds itself in, what, we have done over the last, number of decades due to population growth or development that has led to this situation, and then perhaps some immediate steps that we can take in addition to what the governor has outlined?
Sure. Yeah, we have seen declines in the lake elevation pretty much since like the 80s, right? But if you look over the long-term trend, we have records going back to 1847. So if you look over the long-term trend, we've definitely seen a decrease in our elevations at Great Salt Lake. As I mentioned earlier, we did drop below the previous record low in July of this year. And so that was previously set in 1963. And about 20 years after that, the Great Salt Lake hit its highest elevation on record that we've ever seen. And then now from that point, we've again dropped below the previous record low. So we are seeing decreases in that. There have been some studies that have been done on impacts, and Laura, help me remember, it was in 2014 or 2015 that the white paper came out. I'm trying to remember.
I believe it was in 15.
Yeah, so in 2015, the Division of Water Resources, in conjunction with USU and a number of other people, did a study to understand and model kind of the impacts. Had man not been here, where would the lake elevation be? And I can send that to you, Senator, if you're interested. But we saw about 11-foot decrease from where, if we never showed up, then it would be 11 feet higher than it was today.
So there's some data that says that Utah is the second driest state in the country. And at the same time, we have the highest water use per capita than any other state in the country. So there, it seems to me like perhaps there's a divide between the way that we approach water and the reality that we're confronted with living in a high desert. So where do we need to be as residents, as citizens, as people who care about the environment that we live in? What does the average everyday person, what can we do differently?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And we are one of the driest states in the nation. Depending on what 30-year average, it depends on where we rank. So I'll just say that. So, but we are a very, very dry state, and definitely compete for that top, third, second spot sometimes. And we use a lot of water, right? We have a lot of, sorry, is there, okay. We have a lot of, sorry, I just got sidetracked. We have a lot of green lawns where we use a lot of our water outdoors. And the one thing I'll say kind of as a caveat to your point is being the highest water user is there is no national standard on how water use data is collected. So we could collect our data one way, and then our friends in, south of us may not include secondary water, or they may not include, our friends to the east of us might not include their breweries or their universities in their water use numbers. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison. So it does get a little tricky to say, who uses the most water or not. But to your point, yes, we use a lot of water and we can do better. And there are definite ways that individuals can look to use less. And I can provide some examples for you if that's where you want me to go next.
I think maybe we'll go to Dr. Kelly. It looks like she has her hand raised on this topic. So Dr. Kelly, you're muted.
Oh, muted.
Sorry, I have a question. I've been wondering about this. So I've been hearing that there are some trade-offs between ripping your landscape and putting in hardscape, and watering your landscape so that you have trees and green, because that is less of a heat sink and a heat feedback. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yes. So like all things in life, it's complicated, right? And there's not everything that we do can have a potential effect on it. So if we said, particularly in areas where there is a lot of hardscape, so let's take an example, Salt Lake City, there's a lot of hardscape. So if we all of a sudden said, we're going to remove all of our grass, put down rocks, maybe try to keep our trees alive, it would increase, I'll say likely, increase the temperature in Salt Lake City. So it is important as we think about what we can do to reduce our use, that we kind of have those broad spectrums and, keeping as much vegetation as possible. There's also some great research coming out of USU on what less drought intensive grasses and turfs. So there are a lot of different options out there. I've been trying to say that grass is not bad. It's just how we water the grass we do have, which we typically overwater it. I have this analogy, and I was on this other panel this last week where, we talk about all the different buckets of water that we use. And so residential is one, commercial, industrial, and institutional. But in our residential bucket, how much water we use, about 60% outside. And my my friend, I guess, at Salt Lake City, she's like, the problem is, Candace, is that's a great statistic, but it doesn't tell you that we use like 1.5 times what we should. So we can do a lot better just to irrigate more efficiently right now. And there's great smart timers and technology available. So that's one thing that people can do. And there's a great rebate at utahwatersavers.org where you can get rebates for smart timers up to $75, which pretty much pays for the cost of some of them. And it kind of takes the guesswork out of how much to irrigate your lawns. And then there's also looking at landscaping conversions, as Kelly asked, you've got to do it wisely and think through the things. And there's a lot of beautiful vegetation that's water wise that you can drip irrigate that really reduces our water use.
Thank you so much for that. The whole conversation tonight is intended to relate the drying up of the Great Salt Lake with the impacts to our air quality here along the Wasatch Front. So we've already established that the loss of the lake itself will pose severe threats to human health, generally speaking. But we're also posed to see enormous losses economically. The lake as it currently stands is a huge driver of economic development and growth. It's a multi-billion-dollar resource for the state of Utah. In addition to that, nearly 10 million or so birds pass through the Great Salt Lake and use it to feed on an annual basis and nest and they use it. It's in terms of the hemispheric importance of the lake. I think it would be really great if you, Candace, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that critical role from not only a local and a regional importance, but global importance of the saline lake. So if you could maybe speak to that, and then at the end, could you tell us what keeps you up at night with regard to the lake? What are you most worried about? We've spoken about some optimistic things that we can be mindful of, and the fact that it's not as bad perhaps as some people may think, but what is keeping you up at night on that matter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a drying Great Salt Lake has really far-reaching consequences, and I'll just say this briefly, and I'll ask Laura to chime in as well. And it can, as you already mentioned, can result in increased dust, which worsens our air quality. It also can reduce our snowpack. We get a lot of I think I heard this statistic, about 5 to 7% of our snowpack comes from lake effect snow. So as we have a smaller lake level, there's potential that it'll reduce our snow, which I've already talked about how important our snowpack is to our water supply, reduce lake access, increase salinity, loss of habitat, island bridges. So it has real and far-reaching consequences that all of which that keep me up at night. And I think I'll add one other thing is, this keeps me up at night, is there's no one silver bullet. There's no, if I did this, if we as a society, if I did it or you did it, or we got the legislature to do one thing, there's no silver bullet that's going to fix the issues associated with the Great Salt Lake. And that keeps me up at night, right? That we have to figure out a way to work collaboratively together to work through all those issues. And we had a really great process in which we had HCR 10, which was a resolution on Great Salt Lake. And then we had a work group that came together with a bunch of different strategies on how we can improve those lake levels. And it was a great effort, and just shows the amount of collaboration it's going to take to get to that next phase. But Laura, is there anything I missed that you want to chime in on? And Laura Vernon, she's our Great Salt Lake coordinator and works with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and is a brain about Great Salt Lake. So I wanted to make sure she was on here with me.
Hey, Laura, if you wouldn't mind grabbing the mic, introducing yourself briefly, and then responding to Candace's question, that'd be awesome.
Sure. I can't wait to tell you what keeps me up at night too. So my name is Laura Vernon. I'm the Great Salt Lake coordinator with the Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. I've had this position for about a year. The legislature authorized a full-time Great Salt Lake coordinator position just a year ago. So just still, getting in the groove of this role. I've worked on Great Salt Lake issues for over a decade though. And just to let folks know, the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands manages the state's sovereign land. So we manage the lake bed. We don't manage the water that comes into the lake. That's managed by a different division. So We work closely with Candace and the Division of Water Resources and the Division of Water Rights and Water Quality, but we manage the bed of the lake. And as lake managers or lake bed managers, we're tasked with kind of convening people on all things Great Salt Lake. So that's my role, is kind of the convener, the coordinator to get things done on Great Salt Lake. Candace has talked a lot about the research that's been going on over the last decade. There's been a ton. It's super exciting. So with the help of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council and the Great Salt Lake Technical Team, we've been doing a lot of work to figure out how important the Great Salt Lake is. We know how important it is now. Senator Kitchens, you mentioned $1.3 billion in annual economic revenue, $7,000 or 7,000 jobs are attributed to the lake. We now know that it's going to be, up to $2 billion annually in economic costs and losses if the lake is diminished. And so we know how important the lake is now. And Candace is so right. There is not one silver bullet. I like to think of the Great Salt Lake as a wicked problem where, there is no one solution. The solution isn't cheap. And, you solve one problem somewhere and then it creates another problem somewhere else. I think of like a ball of yarn or string where you're trying to untangle it and you pull one side and then it tightens somewhere else. So that's how I'm feeling about the Great Salt Lake these days. And so it keeps me up that there's no easy answer. There's no magic solution or wand that we can wave. But like just today, I had conversations with search and rescue operations out of the Saltair Marina, and they're concerned if we have another year like this year, we're not going to be able to get search and rescue boats out onto the lake to deal with any plane accidents or boat accidents that should require search and rescue efforts. We have a plane crash about every year and a half on the Great Salt Lake, and we're overdue. So any day we could have a plane crash and we can't get boats out to help with the rescue and recovery efforts. So that's now keeping me up at night. So we've got to figure out how to make access available for search and rescue. And then also today I heard that the brine shrimp, the state of the brine shrimp they're not thriving right now. The brine shrimp harvest season starts tomorrow, Friday. And 40% of the world's brine shrimp comes from the Great Salt Lake. And the brine shrimp are used to feed baby shrimp and baby fish. So if you go to a restaurant and you enjoy shrimp, your shrimp probably ate brine shrimp from the Great Salt Lake. So that industry stands to be impaired because the increased salinity of the lake is causing problems with the brine shrimp reproduction. So those are the things that are going to keep me up tonight.
Yes, and just I want to just add one thing is just not knowing what tomorrow's going to bring, what this winter's going to bring. I mean, if we knew that we're going to have a great winter, we're like, we're good. But just that uncertainty, that also is tough.
So I think we're really interested in finding concrete solutions, and a number of you have already mentioned, or I said emphasized, that we don't have one single solution that will fix the problem for us. And this is sometimes a frustrating piece about public policy, is that we have big problems and it seems like just getting water to the lake might, fix all of our problems, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. As I'm thinking about solutions from a policy standpoint in the legislature, there's a lot that we can do. I've read the report from the Salt Lake Advisory Council, and they had a number of steps that they have outlined that we need to be paying attention to. If I'm not mistaken, 12 steps in particular. But to tease those philosophical steps out into concrete action at a policy level is really where I want to be putting my effort as a policymaker. And so I've just taken down a few notes here, and just 4 items that come to mind And I'd love to get some feedback from you all on what you think, if I'm going in the right direction, and what else we might add to that list. So I think about more inflows to the lake, making sure that we see more water get to the lake. As you mentioned, we can't control how much snow we get in a winter, but certainly there are options upstream on the lakes, or I'm sorry, the rivers and the irrigation practices that see water flow into the lake. As we covered already, the Great Salt Lake is a terminal basin, so it's sort of the very end of the road for a lot of these rivers and streams. So we need to get more water into the lake through our current inflow network. And conservation does work. There's a lot of people who say we need to stop putting pressure on the general public to make small changes, like watering at night or taking shorter showers or things of that nature. And certainly it's not all our fault when you have big agriculture and others using a ton of water. But we certainly do need to see more water into the lake. So inflows are really critical, and wrapped in that are conservation measures and protecting and going more directly toward the watershed. If I'm not mistaken, it's 22 million acres or so that feed into the lake. So the watershed and the inflows. Data is another thing that came to mind. We hear a lot about secondary water metering and increasing efficiency on some of our ag flooding and irrigation practices. The third thing that keeps coming up is the law and legal protections for the lake. So can anybody speak to legal protections and what protecting the lake might allow us as policymakers to do to protect the lake long term? And I guess I only had 3 at the top of my head right now, but those are the 3 items that come up. So can we maybe craft a conversation around those 3 ideas, and then anything else that you may have to offer in terms of solutions? I know that's a lot, sorry, but.
I could chime in about a legal protection. Well, the first, I think, is, the Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands is obligated to uphold the public trust. So we manage land for the public. And if we are considering that impairment to the Great Salt Lake is a violation of the public trust, that could be a legal avenue that we could look at. The decreasing impacts or the adverse air quality, if we take that to be an impact to the public trust, that's an avenue we could explore, I guess. And it's something that's been brought up in other settings. And I'm not advocating for this, but since I've been working on the Great Salt Lake, people have talked about, well, what's the, let me back up. My division, we don't manage the Great Salt Lake to a particular lake level. We know what the ideal lake level is for all the resources. We know, when it's good for birds, when it's good for search and rescue operations. We know where we want it to be, but like we said, we don't have control over that. But throughout the years, there has been people talking about, a certain elevation of water to be left in the lake for the purpose of the lake. And those are 2 options that have been kicked around, or things that have been discussed. I'm not advocating for them per se. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing in the community.
Well, right now we have legal protections for our critical waterways that provide drinking water, right? So we've all established that safe, healthy drinking water is critical to the survival of humans and to our overall health. Right now, the Great Salt Lake doesn't have the same level of protections as some of our potable waterways. So I think the idea is that you protect the Great Salt Lake just as much as you would protect our drinking water, because we have agreed that through data and science that a reduction in the Great Salt Lake, or even a death of the Great Salt Lake, so to speak, would have very clear and obvious negative health consequences for the human species that live along the lake bed, right? So I think that that's the idea about the legal protections, is it would give us as state agencies some authority to go out and start ensuring that we can see additional water flows into the lake. So perhaps there's more to discuss on that. I want to be mindful of time. We're only set to go until 6:30. That's about 15 minutes from now. I'd really like to get some of the public involved in this dialogue. And so I've got Kennedy here to help me, staff support. And so if you in the audience, if you have a question for any of these esteemed professionals here today, or myself as a policymaker, go ahead and click raise that hand, and we'd love to get your voice involved in the dialogue here today. So let's see where we can go.
Senator, while you're queuing up the people, Candace, what do you think about? I believe there's a bill coming forward this legislative session that looks at allowing the division to hold in-stream flow, right? So the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands can hold a water right for the Great Salt Lake. So a level of protection there through the legislature would be, your support would be appreciated for that. Did I do that justice, Candace, or maybe there's more to say on that? Or
no, I think you did great. There is some in-stream flow legislation that should be coming through that makes that previous in-stream flow legislation better and more widely available in most of our accounts.
Great. We'll keep our eyes really close on that matter. So we have 4 hands so far. We're going to start with Denise Chancellor. So I'm going to allow you to speak. Please keep your question to 1 or 2 sentences, pretty brief, so we have an opportunity to dialogue. So we'll go ahead and start with you, Denise.
Good evening. Hi, Bryce. I thought about in-stream flows. You just mentioned that. Would you have to take water away from existing water rights holders, which would be a mammoth battle? That's point number 1. Point number 2 is a question for Bryce. Does EPA have standards for all the heavy metals and toxins that would be swept up from the Great Salt Lake if we found that the lake diminished more and the crust was deteriorating?
Candace, would you mind speaking to the first question, then we'll have Bryce answer the second?
Yeah, so with the in-stream flow legislation that's being proposed, it is based on kind of a willing exchange. So at this point, it would be someone, maybe Forestry, Fire, and State Lands got some funding to help pay for some in-stream flows if it all passes and goes through, that could then go to the lake. So it wouldn't necessarily be mandating or taking water away from existing water rights holders, is my understanding of the legislation.
And then just quickly, so with air toxics that aren't associated with an industrial release, so no, there are no standards. EPA kind of sets criteria that they target to reduce those, but they're mostly focused on industrial controls. And so if we were going to look at an ambient air quality standard for arsenic or one of the other materials that would be entrained in lake bed dust, it would probably have to be a state standard, as it doesn't really fit into the federal Air Quality Clean Air Act regulatory process.
Thank you, Bryce. All right, we're going to move along to Dan. Dan, I'm going to allow you to speak, and the floor is yours. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, question for whoever wants to answer it. Guys said we had 16 days of wildfire issues above the health level. I made the mistake of hiking on one of them. We'll never do that again. Curious if there's any projections on what that looks like, say 10 years from now.
So I'll jump in, and maybe Dr. Kelly has some thoughts on this as well. So as we look over the past 10 years, so 2017 was a big fire year in the West. In 2017, the forest fires consumed about 1% of the forest in the West. And so that puts us onto a 100-year fire cycle, which is back to natural fire cycles. So unfortunately, what we're hearing is, again, absent some other forest management to reduce the fuel load, that wildfires at these levels, on average, what we've seen about the past 10 years is going to be the future. That is the natural forest burning cycle.
And I guess I'll add that, yes, we have a big backlog because we suppressed almost all forest fires prior to recently. So we are on track to see similar levels of smoke for the foreseeable future for us.
Thank you too. All right, we're going to go to Denise Cartwright. Denise, go ahead with your question.
Hi guys, I'm Denise Cartwright. Just for anyone who's listening, so you know, I'm with Save Our Great Salt Lake. We are petitioning the Utah legislature to prioritize the lake in this upcoming session. So if you want to sign our petition, head to our Instagram, that's at Save Our Great Salt Lake. My question is for Candace. I was just down at the lake with Dr. Bonnie Baxter, who's a biologist who runs the Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster. She's on the advisory council for the lake. We were looking at the microbial light structures down at the lake. For those who don't know, these are bacterial structures that power the lake's ecosystem. They do photosynthesis for the lake, and they also provide a vital feeding ground for the brine shrimp and flies, who the millions of migratory birds that visit the lake rely on for food. So these structures sit toward the surface of the lake to absorb sunlight, and with the lake shrinking so fast, they're already being uncovered and dried out. There are hundreds of dead exposed microbialites at the lake right now. It's really tragic. The death of these structures is already leading to a loss of enormous magnitude to the food chain at the Great Salt Lake. So my question is, I know there's legislation being considered, there's some long-term plans in play, but being that these structures are such a vital piece of the lake's ecosystem and they're already dying and drying up, I'm just wondering if there's any short-term plans in the works to reduce diversion to the lake and prevent the impending destruction of the lake's microbialites in the coming months.
Yeah, that is a great point. You did a great job articulating the importance of those microbialites and the risk associated with them that they're experiencing right now. There are, there have been long-term efforts. We've been working on options as far as like water banking and how can we, create market mechanisms for water to get to the lake. There are currently a couple of change applications that go through the Division of Water Rights that have been approved to get additional flows to the lake. But I will be honest with you, Denise, that while those efforts should be applauded and the work that's gone into them is impressive, they are fairly small and they're not going to make a big change to what we're currently facing at this moment. And that's one of the challenges. Like, even if we could right now say, we're going to change this and we're going to, but if we could get rid of all the legal barriers and everything of getting water to Great Salt Lake right now this year, there wasn't water to get there. In Weber Basin Water Conservancy District and on the Weber River, they normally store 220,000 acre feet a year. This year they stored 8,000 acre feet. So this year has been an extreme case, and that's where we really need a good snowpack going into next year.
Laura, would you like to respond as well to that question? Perhaps it's a really sensitive ecosystem out there, and we are seeing the destruction happen on our watch and in front of us. So what are possible, even if they're far-fetched, what are some possible solutions to save this really sensitive ecosystem that all of life in many ways depends on?
It's a good question. I think this is something that's really only come to the forefront for the lake in the last couple of years. We don't know where all the microbialites are in the lake. We've talked about even mapping them to identify where key locations would be that we could, I don't know, like you said, crazy suggestion, impound them. So making sure that they stay hydrated, but we just don't know. We have a general idea of where they are, but we don't have a concrete plan to get out there and keep them wet through. Luckily, we're hoping that, come November, the lake level will start to rise slowly, or at least not drop any further. And the winter precipitation will help keep them wet. So we'll see what we can do that way, but we're open to suggestions, talk about, pie in the sky options for for preserving this, like touchstone or essential element for the food chain for the Great Salt Lake and for the birds that use it. So we're open to suggestions.
The idea of mapping, is that something your division has explored or colleagues of yours have explored? And what might that look like from a legislative standpoint? Do you need legislative partners to pull this off, or is this something you could do on your own?
We need money to pay the pilots to operate. There's some different types of bathymetry, lasers that we would need to fly particular depths to understand exactly, microbialites are at the surface. There are some 10, 15 feet below the surface, not that far. But anyway, we would need funding to help map the microbialites.
Okay. Well, I'll follow up with you on that one in particular offline. I want to make sure we get to as many questions as possible. So we're going to go to the next person in the queue, Marianne Karen. You are up. Please go ahead with your question briefly.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my question. So I'm a wildlife photographer and a birder, and I'm out at Antelope Island quite often. And I've noticed that there is what appears to be a giant pipe going in along the causeway. So I'm wondering what that pipe is. I had heard that they were going to start piping sewage out past Farmington Bay and into the main body of the lake. So my question is that pipe for sewage? If so, what effect will that have on water in the Farmington Bay and water quality in the main body of the lake? And if it's not for sewage, then what exactly is it?
Bryce, do you want to take that from DQ or you want me to take a stab at it? I know air quality is your thing.
Nope, I don't know what it is. Nope.
Okay. So I actually can speak to this a little bit, Senator Kitchen. I was on a tour with Erica Gaddis, the division director at Water Quality, and she was explaining that the North Davis Sewer Treatment Plant has their effluent, and that based on the current requirements to improve the water quality coming out of the effluent stream, and I am once again not a water quality expert, so we really should be talking to Erica Gaddis, but generally speaking, there were concern about what that effluent will continue to do to Farmington Bay. So instead of making a decision at this point, because where they set the standards, they may change those. So rather than making a big upgrade to the plant, they are piping it out past Farmington Bay, with the potential of still having a gate into Farmington Bay, that if the increased flows are needed in that area, that they could still put some of the effluent out there. So this is treated wastewater when we speak about effluent. So it will be going out past Farmington Bay along the causeway that you noted.
Laura, do you have anything to add, or should we move on?
Yeah, no, if I could just chime in really quick. One benefit of this pipeline project is the water that was typically out there is surrounded by Phragmites. Phragmites thrives in this water, this treated water, and also takes up a large amount of water that could be going to the lake bed. And so by moving this out more into the lake, we're decreasing the amount of Phragmites in that area. So a benefit to the Farmington Bay from that perspective.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I appreciate that. We are going to take one more question, and then I'm going to just do a rapid fire round of final words from the panelists. So we're going to go to Mackenzie McMillan. And before we allow Mackenzie to speak, I'd like to acknowledge the about 6 or 7 additional people that have raised their hands that I won't be able to get to tonight. My request to you all is send me an email with your question. It's dkitchen@le.utah.gov, le.utah.gov, and send me your question, and I'll make sure to circulate it with these experts here on the panel, and then get back to you some answers on your questions. So I apologize, I can't get to everybody, but we're going to have the final question here to Mackenzie. Go ahead, please be brief.
Hi, my name is actually Jonathan Moffett. Mackenzie's my fiance. I work out of the Great Salt Lake. One of the questions I had was about US magnesium, or a lot of people know as MagCore. There's a lot of different gases, chlorine, dioxin, several others on that list. And every time when I see a high pressure system settle in, it seems like the inversion almost starts there and just spreads across the whole lake. So I'm wondering if there's any increased restrictions looking at that, especially on our red days for air quality.
Thanks for the question. Bryce, would you like to take that one, please?
So yes, there are no additional restrictions on during high pressure systems or temperature inversions, but certainly a topic of study and recently enforcement actions as well for that facility. So yeah, it is a large source of air pollution, and yeah, the pollutants you mentioned are the ones that are of a concern for us as well.
Appreciate that question, sir. Okay, we're going to wrap up. We're at 6:30, so we'll start with Bryce, then we'll go to Dr. Kelly, and then Candice and Laura. Thank you so much, all of you, for your time tonight. I genuinely appreciate your expertise and your professionalism. I guess at the end of the day, if there's one thing that you want the public to walk away with tonight, what is that? If you could be brief, Bryce, what do you want everybody to not miss from this conversation tonight?
Probably for air quality in particular, get involved. If you need more information, you can visit our website at airquality.utah.gov. That has the monitoring information. And then for public outreach and education, ucare.org. Covers all these issues and a great place to get involved.
And that's ucair.org.
Correct.
Great.
Thanks.
Dr. Kelly?
I guess I'll just mention two things. So I was really struck by how that one single thing is not going to fix any of these problems, air or water, but collectively all of our actions can make a difference. And then also, when you're interested in talking to your legislator, do not stop talking to them on mid-February when you've seen the last inversion and you feel like everything is good, because they sort of have short attention spans.
I'm not going to take umbrage with that one because you're right. Candice, final word from you. What would you want everybody to take away from this conversation today?
Yeah, I guess mine's similar to both Kelly and Bryce. With 3.2 billion people million people in Utah, we have an opportunity to make a difference in how we use water. If each of us does something, we can make a difference in how much water we use. I hear a lot of times like, I'm going to wait till the church or the store or whoever it is or my neighbor stops irrigating and then I'll do something different. But really what we can do individually turns into a collective big thing. And talk to your legislatures. So you're doing it. So good job.
All right, Laura, you're up, and this is final word.
All right, final word. I've heard people say that water that makes it to the Great Salt Lake is wasted water. And I don't think I have to tell this group this, but I would like to say that water to the Great Salt Lake does matter. The lake connects us all. As Senator Kitchen said, it's the namesake for our city, but I just want people to know how valuable the lake is to us from an economic perspective, an ecological perspective, and a public health perspective. And we've seen now, across the world and across the West, how important, wet lakes are. And now is our time to make some pretty significant changes so we can avoid costly problems in the future.
I want to thank all four of you for joining today. Your expertise is so appreciated. And to everybody who joined in on this conversation, I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions, but I hope that this was informative for you. We need you to be involved in this process. There are opportunities at all levels of government, whether it's city, county, state, or federal opportunities. Please stay engaged. If you live in Salt Lake City, there's a chance I'm your legislator. Please let me know how I can do this job better. I'm here to work for you, so let me know. Thank you so much to everybody. Enjoy your evening, and let's save the Great Salt Lake. It's critical. Appreciate it tonight. Thanks.